My name is Alan Gonzalez, an international regulatory analyst from the Food and Drug Administration Latin America office. Welcome to this webinar, which aims to provide information about the Produce Safety Rule and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, as well as highlight FDA resources for stakeholders on each rule. Before the development of this topic, I would like to talk about the FDA Office for Latin America and its mission. The FDA has its headquarters in Maryland in the U.S. However, given the large volume of the import products that are under FDA's jurisdiction, many years ago this agency decided to open regional offices in certain strategic places around the world. These offices were open to promote an approach with the competent authorities, with the producers, with academia and other stakeholders to promote a joint work to achieve more successful exports for the benefits of all parties. This is the reason why we have the regional office for Latin America based in San Jose, Costa Rica, with satellite offices in Mexico City and Santiago, Chile. There are also regional offices in Europe, India, and China. Our office is your point of contact with the FDA, having the advantage of being closer. Our mission is to help ensure the safety, quality, and effectiveness of medical products and food produced in the region for export to the U.S. More concretely, understanding the capacity of governments to manage, evaluate, and regulate products to ensure product safety and effectiveness. Providing information, tools, and training to help build or strengthen their regulatory capacity. Sharing resources to support scientific-based regulatory decision-making and to seek the best possible solutions for public health. And finally, monitoring and reporting regulatory and manufacturing trends and emerging public health events that have the potential to impact the safety of FDA-regulated products produced in the region for export to the United States. Our office is at your service, and we are available through the contact that you can see in this slide. We would like to thank our colleagues from the Foreign Agricultural Service for their leadership and collaboration with the FDA in promoting and conducting this event. The slogan of today's webinar is Fresh Produce covered by FDA's Produce Safety Rule. So please route any questions relating to other FDA-regulated commodities to the link shown here. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be shared to our website in addition to a variety of other resources related with the Product Safety Rule and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Now I'm glad to welcome Dr. Mauricio Castelo, who is an FDA product safety expert. Thank you for your attention. Dr. Castelo, I give you the floor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this information with you today. My name is Trevor Gilbert, and I am within the Division of Produce Safety at the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. I am currently filling in for Dr. Mauricio Castillo, who will be with us shortly for the live session. Mauricio is actually our Produce Safety Network expert for the Latin America and Caribbean region. In the US FDA, the Division of Produce Safety is the work unit responsible for writing and updating produce safety rule, developing guidance for the industry, leading the development and delivery of FDA-supported produce safety educational initiatives, and providing technical assistance to members of the agricultural community when questions come up about the produce safety rule, the guidance, and the underlying science. My main focus today with the division is to support with education, training, outreach, and the technical assistance initiatives to farmers and farms in Latin America for the implementation and compliance with the produce safety rule. I am really happy to support the farmers in Latin America with the resources offered by the FDA for compliance with the produce safety rule, and at the same time to bring the message of the regulations to producers in Latin America. Today, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about two of the FSMA regulations. First, we are going to talk about the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is the FSVP. And second, we'll talk about the produce safety rule, or the PSR. I know there will be a lot of information that we are going to share today and not enough time. So I would like you to participate in the Q&A session at the end that we are going to have, so you can send your presentation, your questions to the FDA mailbox that will be given to you at the end of the presentation. As you can see from this slide, the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, was signed into law by President Obama in 2011. Under FSMA, there are 7 fundamental regulations. 1, the Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, which is highlighted, which we'll speak of more later on, is the purpose of this rule is that it makes importers responsible for ensuring that foreign food suppliers provide the same level of public health protection as is required by U.S. food producers. In other words, the importer will verify that the foreign supplier complies with FSMA regulations. The second foundational rule, the produce safety rule, also highlighted, which we will cover in today's webinar in more detail. It establishes for the first time science-based standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce on domestic and foreign farms. The third foundational rule, preventive controls of human food, which establishes safety requirements for facilities that process, package, or store human food. Fourth, preventive controls of animal food. In this case, the objective is to protect animal food and feed from contaminants. The other rule is the third-party accreditation rule. It establishes a voluntary program for the accreditation of third-party auditors to conduct food safety audits and issue certifications of foreign facilities and the food they produce. The sixth rule is intentional adulteration, and this would require facilities to implement a food defense plan to prevent actions intended to cause large-scale public harm. And finally, the sanitary transportation of food rule details the use of sanitary transportation practices to ensure safety of the food during transport. FDA will continue to build on FSMA's achievement through the New Era of Smarter Food Safety initiative announced in April 2019 to create a more digital, traceable, and safe food system. One of the objectives of this New Age initiative is to reduce the number of foodborne illnesses. Each year, FSMA requirements will be further integrated into the global food system, and we will be increasingly equipped with technologies, tools, and approaches in a New Era of Smarter Food Safety initiative. More information about the new era of smarter food safety can be found in the link that we are going to present in the slide that we have at the end of the presentation. As I mentioned in the first part, we will talk about the FSVP and what is important under the FSVP to comply with the produce safety rule. So what is FSVP? The FSVP requires importers to develop, maintain, and follow a verification program for each food from each foreign supplier. An importer must perform risk-based foreign supplier verification activities to ensure that the foreign supplier is producing food using processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as those required by the preventive control regulations of the produce safety rule, and also ensure that food is not adulterated or mislabeled with respect to allergen labeling. In other words, if you export fresh produce, the importer must ensure that you comply with the produce safety rule. Also, remember, if you are under the preventive controls regulation as part of the supply chain preventive control, you must know the produce safety rule to do the verification for your supplier, that is the farm that provides the fresh produce. So as I mentioned before, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, or the FSVP, is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. The program does not have inspectional authority under Section 704. Rather, FDA authority is under Section 805 of the FD&C Act. Section 805 of the FD&C Act gives FDA the authority to request, obtain, and review an importer's records. More information about the FSVP can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations 21 CFR Part 1, Subpart L, and is divided into 15 sections. So now let's look at the purpose of the FSVP. Again, as mentioned earlier, the purpose is to provide assurance that foreign suppliers produce food by requiring importers to verify that their foreign suppliers comply with the safety standards using processes and procedures that provides the same level of public health protection as the preventive controls of the PSR, and that the food is not adulterated or mislabeled in relation to labeling allergens. FSVP is the means of ensuring that quality steps are also built into the foreign supply chain by requiring FSVP importers to verify that their foreign suppliers meet applicable FDA safety standards. Additionally, FSVP ensures that foreign suppliers produce food using processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as the preventive controls and the produce safety rule. And another purpose of the FSVP is to create a level of similarity between U.S. food producers and foreign food producers. So who must comply with the FSVP? The Foreign Supplier Verification Program requires importers to have a verification program for each food and facility that imports into the United States. And unless you are exempt, the requirements of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program apply to all food imported and offered for import into the United States and to importers of such foods. So depending on the foods that are imported by the importer, the FSVP requirements will vary. Importer responsibilities associated with the FSVP requirements include the development of an FSVP, perform verification by a qualified person or auditor, conducting a hazard analysis, evaluating the risk posed by a food and for the performance of the foreign supplier, approving their foreign suppliers, performing appropriate foreign supplier verification activities, implementing corrective actions, providing identification at the time of entry, and maintaining records. Understanding the definition of importer is critical for understanding the regulations and for effective implementation. Remember, the importer is responsible for ensuring that the food being imported into the United States is safe. The FSVP regulation defines importer as the U.S. owner or consignee of an article of food that is offered for import into the United States. If there is no U.S. owner or consignee of an article of food at the time of entry, the importer is the U.S. agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee at the time of entry, as confirmed in the signed statement of consent to serve as the importer under the FSVP regulations. So for FSVP implementation, while FDA is still in an educate while we regulate mode, the agency will take enforcement action to protect the public health and to address egregious continued non-compliance observations. FDA began inspections in 2017 following an educate while we regulate mode. Educate while we regulate means to take a soft approach while at the same time working with importers to achieve compliance. FDA has been conducting FSVP inspections with a primary focus on helping importers understand the requirements and how to take corrective actions if deficiencies are observed. So we educate while we regulate, but at the same time, we have moved forward with enforcement. So while educate while we regulate will continue, we will take more steps to ensure compliance with FSVP, including re-inspecting importers that had deficiencies in previous inspections and by acting immediately when FSVP deficiencies are found that pose an imminent public health risk. So what are the consequences if I do not comply with the FSVP? The FDA may refuse admission to the United States of your product if it does not meet the requirements of the FSVP. In addition, the United States may bring criminal proceedings against a person who is responsible for the commission of a prohibited act, in this case, the importer. It is also important to note that the FDA may use other tools such as the input alert as seen in this screen. The input alert is an important part of the FSVP and can be applied to any importer in violation of the rule. Input alert name. It's detention without physical examination of human and animal foods imported from foreign suppliers by importers who are not in compliance with the requirements of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program regulation. The warning part of the warning letter for FSVP includes action FDA will take if the importer does not get themselves into compliance. This means placing the importer on import alert. Import Alert 99-41 was published on July 31st, 2019. This import alert, or IA, is specific to the importer, foreign supplier, and the foods they import. The basis of the import alert is non-compliance with FSVP. To be clear on what this means, there is no lab testing that can show compliance with FSVP, so private labs will not get the products released. There is no 5-cleared shipments for removal from the import alert. Only through demonstration of compliance with their responsibilities under FSVP can an FSVP importer gain removal from import alert and begin importing foods again. The vast majority of importers want to do well and import safe products and make an effort to comply with US requirements. For those importers, we'll take their compliance into account for our entry screening and targeting. Those importers will also see benefits from having less risk of problems with their products by avoiding issues that can lead to recalls, product withdrawals, and liability. So in summary, these are the key points of the FSVP. The overall purpose of an FSVP is for importers to be able to provide adequate assurances that their foreign suppliers are producing food by using processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as the appropriate preventive controls or produce safety rule, and to ensure that the supplier's food is not adulterated or misbranded with respect to allergen labeling. Also, consistent with our other FSMA rules, FSVP is designed to be risk-based because it takes into account different types of hazards, importers, and suppliers. Also, in summary, the rule gives importers flexibility in meeting the requirements to accommodate modern global supply chains by allowing importers to rely on activities conducted by others. And finally, this rule is very closely aligned with the supply chain provisions of the preventive control regulations to avoid imposing redundant requirements and ensure a level playing field for domestic and foreign suppliers. So now let's go into the second part of the webinar, and we will take a brief look at the produce safety rule, as is known as the standards for grain harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. During the presentation, we will see words and terms that are used in the language of the produce safety rule. For example, you will hear me say the word covered. A covered farm or covered activity means that the farm or activity have to comply with the produce safety rule. Another example, in the case of agricultural water, it is water used for irrigation, application of chemicals, and that is in contact with the harvestable portion of the plant or fruit. And of course, water that is used before and after the harvest for washing hands, equipment, washing produce, and other uses. If there are other words or terms you hear during the presentation, please let me know. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions, and I would like for you to participate in this section as well. So what is the produce safety rule? As mentioned earlier, they are the minimum science-based standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce. A key point of the produce safety rule is that the standards focus on the biological hazards related to the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce, and is based on the foundation of the good agricultural practices, or as known GAPs. We utilized our scientific assessment, including a qualitative assessment of risk, as well as past experience that informed an integrated approach that targets practices rather than specific commodities. We also focused on routes of contamination for biological hazards associated with produce, recognizing that unsafe practices can lead to unsafe produce, irrespective of the commodity. So our integrated approach to the regulatory framework includes several regulatory approaches that we have used in the past as an agency, with some standards that are similar to current good manufacturing practices when routes of contamination are well established. Other standards rely on a monitoring approach to allow for operations to evaluate risk in a way that accounts for the diversity of expected conditions on individual farms, which is known as farm specific, and in a few instances, very specific to numerical criteria were established that could be applied broadly across a wide range of conditions. Also remember that the most common sources of contamination of produce are water, animals, soil, humans and buildings, equipment, tools, and the standards are based on all these resources, all these as sources of contamination. Who has to comply with the produce safety rule? If your farm is covered by the standard, then you have to comply with the produce safety rule. That's not an option. In other words, if you export to the United States and you are under the definition of what is a covered farm or a covered activity, then you have to comply with the standards set forth in the produce safety rule. Very important. Why is produce safety important? As we know, fruits and vegetables are a key part of a healthy diet. But because of the way produce is often grown, handled, and consumed, which is often raw, it can become contaminated with foodborne pathogens that can make consumers sick. And as you know, the most common pathogens in fruits and vegetables are Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, Cyclospora, and others. Once a produce is contaminated with a pathogen, it is very difficult to remove the contamination. What I mean by this is that because of the surface of the product, such as melon, which has a rough surface, it is very difficult to wash and remove contamination. Remember that the sanitizer that is used in the water for washing produce is only to maintain the quality of the water. Another important factor why the produce safety rule is important is due to the number of outbreaks that have been associated with produce. For example, outbreaks have historically been linked to produce, as in the case of the 2011 outbreak of the melon with Listeria. In 2012, the spinach with E. coli. In 2013, the outbreak of cucumbers with Salmonella. In 2017, we have papaya with Salmonella. In 2018 and 19, lettuce with E. coli. And in 2019, again, papayas being contaminated with Salmonella. looking at the produce safety rule standards, and as we move into talking about specific sections of the rule, it is important to note that this is an overview and does not cover all of the details within each subpart. So we encourage you to review the codified portion of the rule, which is 21 CFR Part 112, to better understand all of the requirements. For example, if I want to know what are the training requirements as established in the produce safety rule, I'll find them in subpart C. And subpart C, according to the slide, is personnel qualifications and training. It is very important that you know the codes and requirements of each of the subparts for the implementation and compliance of the produce safety rule. When an FDA inspector inspects your farm and finds an observation during the inspection, the inspector will indicate the subpart of the rule using the standard code. For example, if during the inspection, the inspector observes the harvest of a fresh produce and observes that an employee does not wash his hands after using the restroom, then the inspector can ask you about the training records and frequency of training. And depending on the findings, the inspector can indicate a code of subpart C or subpart D, or if there are no facilities for hand washing, then can indicate subpart L, which speaks specifically about the requirements of hand washing facilities. Another example, if the inspector observes that you are using biological soil amendments and checks that the label of the biological soil amendments and find that it is not treated, then he might ask you about the application method and when what is applied, and depending on the findings, he can indicate a code of the subpart F. And as you see on the screen, subpart F deals specifically with biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. Another key point is to remember that the produce safety rule is based on prevention and focuses on conditions and practices identified as possible factors contributing to microbial contamination of produce. So several of the special areas focused on common routes of contamination include agricultural water, which defined as water that is intended to or likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. Biological soil amendments of animal origin, worker health and hygiene, equipment, tools, buildings and sanitation, domesticated and wild animals, and there are also additional requirements for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities that may cut across the 5 major routes of contamination. Again, keep in mind, the focus of the produce safety rule is on practice. Poor practices can lead to contaminated produce. So general provisions, are you covered by the produce safety rule? So as we move into talking about specific sections of the rule, it is important again, as previously mentioned, that this is just an overview and does not cover all of the details. So we will briefly talk about some of the requirements of the subparts, and the subparts were listed on the previous slide. In subpart A, general provisions, we will only see what the requirements are to comply with the produce safety rule and if your farm is covered by the produce safety rule. There are 3 very important terms to know if you have to comply with the produce safety rule. 1, covered farm. 2, covered produce. And 3, covered activity. So first, let's discuss the terms as written in the rule. So covered farm. And under the definition of the farm, there are two types of operations, a primary production farm and farms with secondary activities. Primary production farm. A primary production farm is an operation under one management in one general but not necessarily contiguous physical location devoted to the growing, harvesting, or any combination of these activities. Secondary activities farm. A secondary activities farm is an operation not located on a primary production farm and is devoted to harvesting, packing, and or holding of raw agricultural commodities, provided that the primary production farm that grows, harvests, and or raises the majority of the raw agricultural commodities harvested, packed, and or held by the secondary activities farm owns or jointly owns a majority interest in the secondary activities farm. In other words, if in your installation you pack fresh produce from other farms, but most of the fresh produce come from your farms, more than 50%, this is known as a secondary activity, and you have to comply with the produce safety rule. Also, in Subpart A, we find information about the farms that are not covered by the produce safety rule and the requirements for farms that are eligible for modified requirements of the produce safety rule. Now let's talk about the fresh produce that are subject to this rule, which is known as covered produce. And this includes domestically grown produce and internationally imported produce. Covered produce is known as raw agricultural commodity, or RAC. FDA has a definition for raw agricultural commodity, and there is a list of these products. If you want to know if your fresh produce is covered, see the list of covered produce in the Code of Standard 112.1a. The produce safety rule does not cover produce that is rarely consumed raw and produced for personal or on-farm consumption. Likewise, if you want to know more about produce that is rarely consumed raw or not covered by the produce safety rule, refer to the list in the Code 112.2a1. The rule provides an exemption for produce that receives commercial processing that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms of public health significance, that is via a kill step, as long as certain disclosures are made and appropriate documentation occurs. We already talked about the first two terms, covered farm and covered produce. Now we will talk about covered activity, which are the activities during growing, harvesting, packing, and the holding of produce. It is very important which activities are allowed under the produce safety rule. For example, cutting during harvest is part of the activity under the produce safety rule. But if cutting is done at packing, now this is a process activity and is not under the produce safety rule. In this case, you might have to comply with another regulation such as a preventive control for human food. In Subpart C, there are requirements for training. Remember that in most activities for growing, harvesting, packing, the employees play a very important role in the safety of produce because they are in direct contact with the produce or the contact surfaces that touch the product and can introduce contamination while handling produce or food contact surfaces. All personnel not only be qualified to perform their assigned duties, but also should understand how their actions impact food safety and the regulatory requirements that apply to their assigned duties. That's why the produce safety rule focuses on employee training. So in this subpart, you will find information about what are some of the training requirements and recommendations. All personnel who handle produce or food contact surfaces or engage in the supervision of such activities must receive training upon hiring, periodically, at least once annually, and as necessary and appropriate in light of observations or information indicating that personnel are not meeting the standards set forth in the produce safety rule. You should also identify additional personnel who would benefit from training because they work on a produce farm, even if it is not required for their specific duties. Personnel should also be trained when changes occur in practices or procedures, or when new information on best practices for food safety becomes available. What training topics are required and recommended? So at the minimum, personnel who handle produce and food contact surfaces and those who supervise such activities are required to receive training that covers principles of food hygiene, food safety, health and personal hygiene, and the standards established throughout the produce safety rules that are applicable to the employee's job responsibilities. Harvest personnel. Persons that conduct harvest activities for covered produce must also receive training that includes all of the following: recognizing covered produce that must not be harvested, inspecting harvest containers and equipment to ensure that they are functioning properly, clean, and maintained so as not to become a source of contamination of covered produce, and correcting problems with harvest containers or equipment, or reporting such problems to the supervisor or other responsible party as appropriate to the person's job responsibilities. Now, let's talk about some of the requirements and recommendations for supervisor training. At least one supervisor or responsible party must have successfully completed food safety training that is at least equivalent to that received under standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA or recognized by the FDA. The curriculum developed by the Produce Safety Alliance is one way to satisfy this requirement. Let's take a closer look at subpart B, health and hygiene. And you will find requirements in terms of what are the minimum hygienic requirements for personal handling produce or food contact surfaces. And these will include, they must maintain adequate personal cleanliness. They must avoid contact with animals, other than working animals while performing covered activities. They must wash hands thoroughly. Appropriate hand washing with water and soap is an essential part of the produce safety rule, as seen in the slide. The use of sanitizers is not a substitute for hand washing. Also, they must remove or cover hand jewelry that cannot be adequately cleaned and sanitized during periods in which covered produce is manipulated by hand. They must not eat, chew gum, or use tobacco products in areas used for a covered activity. Remember, unhygienic practices by farm personnel have contributed to some outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. People can spread communicable diseases even if they don't show symptoms. Subpart E, agricultural water. There are requirements for agricultural water and currently under review. This subpart of the standard was given a 4-year extension for compliance. So for the time being, it is recommended that you follow the good practices in the use of agricultural water. More information about agricultural water will be shared as soon as is available. Subpart F, you will find information about the requirements in the use of biological soil amendments, application of the amendments, treatment of amendments, and records required by the produce safety rule. Subpart I deals with domesticated and wild animals, and you will find the requirements in the use of animals in farms. Determination of what is known as areas of non-harvest when evidence of contamination with animals in the farm is found, pre-harvest risk assessments as well. Both domesticated and wild animals can be the sources of microorganisms that can contaminate produce and cause foodborne illness. They can all carry disease-causing microorganisms in their feces that can survive for prolonged periods of time when deposited in soil and water, and can be transferred to people through contaminated produce that enters the food supply. So what should I do if significant evidence of potential contamination is found? So if you have determined that there is significant evidence of potential contamination by animals on your farm, you will then need to determine whether you can harvest the produce in the affected areas. You may, for example, determine that only a certain part of a growing area has been affected and should be designated as an area in which the crops should not be harvested, which is like a no-harvest zone. So under subpart K, you will find the requirements such as the measurements that are required. If you group both covered produce and produce that is not subject to the produce safety rule, what must you do? And what are some of the recommendations? It also covers what measures are required to identify and not harvest produce that is likely to be contaminated, and what are some of the recommended practices. Subpart K also covers what should you do with products that fall to the ground before harvest. And that is referred to as dropped covered produce. In subpart L, you will find the requirements and the recommendations for buildings subject to the produce safety rule. Buildings are required to be of suitable size, construction, and design to facilitate maintenance and sanitary operations for covered activities to reduce the potential for contamination of produce or food contact surfaces. So what are some of the requirements and recommendations for toilet facilities? Toilet facilities must be available and readily accessible to all personnel working on your farm and to visitors as well. Toilet facilities should be within reasonable walking distance of where employees are working in areas where covered activities occur. You should also have procedures and schedules in place for monitoring, servicing, and cleaning your toilet facilities. Also in subpart L, we look at what are some of the requirements and recommendations for hand washing facilities. As per the produce safety rule in subpart L, you are required to provide hand washing facilities for both personnel and visitors to your farm. These facilities must be readily accessible during harvest, packing, and holding activities, and during growing activities that take place in a fully enclosed building. And the requirements of the standards for the cleaning sanitation program as well. And we look at subpart O, records. You will find the requirements for the information that must include all records, such as the name and location of your farm, actual values and observations obtained during monitoring, the date and time. Records must be created when the activity is performed or observed. Records must be accurate and readable. The rule specifies with date, sign, or initials of the people who perform the activity. Some records must be reviewed, dated, and signed within a reasonable time after the records are made by a supervisor or a responsible party. Also in subpart O, records, what are the requirements for storing and keeping records? One of the requirements is that they must be available and accessible. You must keep them for at least 2 years from the date the record was created. And another records require up to 4 years. So there are 3 general, very important documents in the implementation and compliance with the regulation. You have the code, preamble, and guidance as indicated by this slide. As noted in the first column, a rule includes the codified language, which states the specific legally binding requirements. In many cases, legal requirements use the word must, as you have heard me use throughout this presentation. The codified portion is the numbered section near the end of the document. Moving on to the next column, the preamble, which often represents the bulk of the rule. It outlines our thinking as we developed the rule, the rationale for the provisions in the codified, and for a final rule includes responses to comments received on the proposed rule. So now let's review some information about guidance documents that's highlighted in the third column. Guidance documents contain non-binding recommendations to assist you in understanding how to comply with the rule requirements. Guidance documents, when finalized, describe our thinking, and in some cases, we update them from time to time. Our recommendations in the guidance often use the word should or recommend. So in a guidance document, the use of the word must or the citation of a specific provision number specifies a rule requirement. So this slide is information about some of the resources that are available on our website. In addition to the FDA Produce Safety webpage, we encourage you to visit our webpage for the draft guidance listed on the slide. The draft guidance document is available for download there as well. Moving on, we also have fact sheets available on our final produce safety rule website, which is provided on the slide, and these are also related to rarely consumed or produced, drop-covered produce, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and other fact sheets as well. And the link for a new era of smarter food safety. Next, an important way to communicate with us continues to be the Technical Assistance Network, we call it the TAN, reference at the bottom of the slide. If you have questions about FSVP, the TAN is a useful way for us to receive questions and to provide an answer to your question. And we have other resources, and at the end of the presentation, I will give you my contact details, and you can contact me, and I will be more than happy to send you the complete list. This is a list of resources available for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, such as fact sheets, what to do in a Foreign Supplier Verification Program's inspections, key requirements, the final rule on Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, am I subject to the FSVP, and at a glance, which is the final rule on Foreign Supplier Verification Programs. And finally, these are the key points for implementation and compliance with the produce safety rule. On the education, of course, the first step is the education through training and using the resources I mentioned previously. Secondly, evaluation of the safety risk for fresh produce in each of the standards based on the 5 sources of contamination: water, animals, soils, human equipment, balings, and tools. 3, create procedures to comply with and implement the standards. Another tool for implementing the standards, practices to monitor and make corrective actions. And finally, maintaining records. Another resource available is the mailbox that we recently created for any questions you may have about the produce safety rule. It is the Produce Safety Network en Español at fda.hhs.gov. This is a direct resource for technical assistance on the produce safety rule, and you can send us questions in English or Spanish. And finally, I want to thank you for participating in this webinar today. And please consider me as a direct resource for technical assistance on the produce safety rule. If you have questions from the standard, the guide, definition of farm, and other questions related to the produce safety rule, please do not hesitate to connect with me. Or again, you can use the FDA new mailbox, Produce Safety Network en Español, as listed here. And now, we are going to start with the Q&A session, and of course, I encourage you to participate. When you registered to this webinar, you received a confirmation email with a link for the Q&A session. Select that link to enter the session, so I will see you in a moment there.